The summer of 1994 was supposed to be a celebration of everything heavy metal had built over 2 decades. And when 50,000 fans packed into the legendary Donington Park for that year's Monsters of Rock festival, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of history being made. Metallica was at the absolute peak of their powers, riding the massive commercial wave of the Black Album that had turned them from underground thrash kings into the biggest metal band on the planet. And James Hetfield walked that stage like a man who believed he owned every square inch of it. But backstage, in a cramped area thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of warm Jack Daniels, a 48-year-old man with a face like carved leather and a Rickenbacker bass slung low across his hips was watching the monitor with an expression that could have frozen fire. Lemmy Kilmister had been playing stages like this before James Hetfield had even picked up his first guitar, and what was about to unfold between these two titans of metal would create a moment so tense, so raw, and so brutally honest that the 50,000 people standing in that English field would fall into a silence so deep you could hear the wind cutting across the festival grounds. Nobody in that crowd could have predicted that a single word, spoken half as a joke and half as a challenge, would ignite a confrontation that the metal world would whisper about for the next 3 decades, and that Lemmy's response would reveal something about the old guard of rock and roll that no interview, no documentary, and no biography had ever managed to capture. If you are new here and you enjoy untold stories from the golden age of rock and heavy metal, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another one. The road to Donington. To understand what happened on that stage, you have to go back and understand who these two men really were by the summer of 1994, because this was not just a clash of egos. It was a collision of two completely different philosophies about what heavy metal was supposed to be, what it was supposed to stand for, and who had the right to carry its flag. James Hetfield was 30 years old, a California-bred giant who had spent the last decade building Metallica into the most commercially successful metal band in history. The Black Album had sold over 16 million copies worldwide by that point, and Hetfield had transformed from a shy, angry kid from Downey into a frontman who commanded arenas with the confidence of a general leading troops into battle. He had earned every bit of that swagger through years of relentless touring, through the devastating loss of Cliff Burton on that frozen Swedish highway in 1986, through the internal wars over musical direction that nearly tore the band apart during the recording of And Justice for All. Hetfield had survived it all and come out the other side as metal's new king, and he knew it, and more importantly, everyone around him knew it too. But there was a problem with being the king of metal in 1994, and that problem had a name, a Rickenbacker bass, and an appetite for Jack Daniels that could drain a distillery dry. Lemmy Kilmister was not just older than Hetfield. He was from an entirely different universe of rock and roll, a universe that existed before MTV, before corporate sponsorships, before metal bands played stadiums with laser light shows and pyrotechnics that cost more than most people's houses. Lemmy had been Jimi Hendrix's roadie in the late 1960s, running acid and psychedelics through the London underground when James Hetfield was still in diapers. He had played bass in Hawkwind through the early 70s, touring through a haze of space rock and amphetamines until that fateful night at the Canadian border in 1975 when customs agents found white powder in his bag and everything fell apart. They thought it was cocaine. It was speed. Hawkwind fired him anyway, and out of that betrayal and rage, Motorhead was born, a band so loud, so fast, and so unapologetically savage that it essentially built the bridge between punk rock and heavy metal that every thrash band, including Metallica, would later cross to find their sound. The weight of two worlds. This is what made the dynamic between Hetfield and Lemmy so complicated and so combustible. Hetfield openly worshipped Motorhead. He had said in multiple interviews that hearing Ace of Spades for the first time had been like getting punched in the chest by God, and that without Lemmy's relentless sonic assault, Metallica might never have found the speed and aggression that defined their early work on Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning. Lemmy was, in every meaningful sense, one of the godfathers of the music that had made Hetfield a multimillionaire and a household name. But here was the tension that nobody talked about openly, the tension that had been building for years beneath the surface of polite backstage handshakes and mutual compliments in magazine interviews. By 1994, Metallica was selling out stadiums and topping charts, while Motorhead was still grinding through clubs and mid-sized venues, still fighting for relevance in a musical landscape that had shifted dramatically toward the polished, radio-friendly sound that the Black Album had helped create. Lemmy never complained about it publicly, because complaining was not something Lemmy did about anything, ever. But the people closest to him noticed a change in how he talked about the new generation of metal bands, a sharpness in his voice, a barely concealed edge that suggested the old lion was not entirely comfortable watching the cubs he had raised take over the kingdom. The festival lineup that day had placed Motorhead in an earlier afternoon slot, a position that some of Lemmy's crew privately considered an insult for a man who had been headlining festivals, when most of the other bands on the bill were still in school. Lemmy himself said nothing about it, at least not where anyone with a tape recorder could hear, but those who knew him well enough to read the micro-expressions on that famously stoic face could see something simmering behind his eyes, something that the afternoon sun and the growing crowd noise was slowly heating toward a boiling point. Motorhead had delivered a blistering set that afternoon, 45 minutes of pure sonic warfare that left the early crowd stunned and shaking, and Lemmy had walked off that stage with the satisfaction of a man who knew he had just reminded 50,000 people exactly who had built the house they were all standing in. The moment everything changed asterisk. What happened next has been told in fragments and whispers across metal forums, in backstage rumors that mutated with every retelling, and in carefully worded paragraphs of rock biographies that always seemed to stop just short of telling the whole truth. But the people who were actually there, the roadies and the sound engineers and the festival staff who witnessed it with their own eyes, they remember every single second of it with a clarity that 3 decades have done nothing to diminish. Metallica took the stage as the headliner that evening, and the crowd erupted with the kind of ferocity that only a band at the absolute zenith of their cultural power can generate. Hetfield was electric from the first note, stalking the stage with his Explorer guitar slung low, his voice cutting through the summer air like a blade. The setlist was a greatest hits assault, Master of Puppets flowing into Enter Sandman, and the crowd was a living, breathing organism of 50,000 voices singing every word back at the stage. It was between songs, during one of those brief moments of crowd interaction that Hetfield loved to stretch out, milking the energy, reading the audience like a book, that everything went sideways. Somebody in the front rows, maybe a Motorhead fan still buzzing from the afternoon set, shouted something about Lemmy. The exact words have been debated for years, but what is agreed upon is that Hetfield heard it, grabbed the moment, and with a grin that split his face wide open, leaned into the microphone and said something along the lines of the old man already had his turn. The crowd laughed. It was a throwaway comment, the kind of casual stage banter that frontmen deliver a dozen times per show without thinking twice about it. Hetfield certainly did not think twice about it. He turned back to his bandmates, counted in the next song, and the wall of sound crashed forward again. But what Hetfield did not know, what nobody on that stage or in that crew could have known, was that Lemmy was watching from the side of the stage, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the lights, close enough to hear every word through the monitor wedges, and close enough for the crew members standing nearby to see his jaw tighten, and his hand grip the neck of his Jack Daniels bottle just a little bit harder. The walk. What Lemmy did next is what separates this story from every other backstage squabble in rock and roll history. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. He did not send a roadie with a message or wait until after the show to confront Hetfield in private. Instead, Lemmy did something that took more raw courage than any mosh pit, any bar fight, any drug-fueled confrontation in any backstage hallway in the history of loud music. He walked. Slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried pace of a man who had been walking toward trouble his entire life and had never once turned around, Lemmy Kilmister stepped out of the shadows and onto the stage of the biggest metal festival in the world, in front of 50,000 people, while Metallica was still playing. The security team froze. The stage manager grabbed his radio and started barking orders that nobody followed because nobody knew the protocol for when a living legend decides to crash the headliner's set at Donington Park. Metallica's crew exchanged panicked glances, but nobody moved to stop him, partly because there was no established procedure for this situation, and partly because it was Lemmy. And stopping Lemmy from doing anything he had decided to do was roughly equivalent to stopping a freight train with a polite suggestion. Hetfield saw him first. The guitar work faltered for half a beat, just enough for the trained ears in the crowd to notice, and Hetfield turned to see Lemmy walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that in any other context would have preceded a fist fight. The crowd, that massive living organism of 50,000 metal fans, began to realize something extraordinary was happening. The cheering shifted to murmuring. The murmuring shifted to a kind of breathless anticipation. And by the time Lemmy reached center stage and stood face to face with James Hetfield, the silence was so complete that people standing 200 meters from the stage later swore they could hear the wind. Face to face. The two men stood there for what witnesses describe as anywhere from 5 seconds to 30, depending on how close they were and how dramatically their memory has seasoned the moment over the years. Hetfield, to his credit, did not back away. He stood his ground, guitar hanging silent against his body, and looked Lemmy directly in the eyes. The rest of Metallica had stopped playing by this point. Lars Ulrich frozen behind his drum kit with his sticks hovering in midair, Kirk Hammett standing motionless near his amp stack, Jason Newsted gripping his bass like a man holding onto a life raft in a storm. The entire production, the lights, the sound, the massive video screens flanking the stage, everything continued to run on autopilot while two generations of heavy metal stood inches apart and the world held its breath. What Lemmy said to Hetfield in that moment has become one of the most debated quotes in metal history, because only a handful of people were close enough to hear it clearly, and those people have told slightly different versions over the years. But the core of it has remained consistent across every account. Lemmy leaned in close enough that Hetfield could smell the Jack Daniels and Marlboro smoke that permanently surrounded him like a personal atmosphere. And in a voice that was low enough to stay between the two of them, but intense enough to carry the weight of 20 years of rock and roll survival, he told Hetfield that he had been playing this music since before Hetfield had learned to shave. That every riff Metallica had ever written owed a debt to the bands that had bled for this sound in clubs and bars and filthy tour vans long before anyone was selling 16 million records, and that if Hetfield ever called him old man again, on this stage or any stage, he would find out exactly how much fight the old man still had left in him. 50,000 witnesses. The crowd could not hear the words, but they could read the body language, and body language does not lie. They could see Lemmy's rigid posture, the controlled fury in his frame, the way his chin was set like a man preparing to take a punch or throw one. They could see Hetfield, the most dominant frontman in metal, standing absolutely still, his usual swagger completely absent, his face cycling through emotions that the giant video screens broadcast to every corner of that field. Shock, recognition. Something that might have been shame, and then, remarkably, something that looked very much like respect. The silence held for another few agonizing seconds before Lemmy turned his back on Hetfield and walked off the stage the same way he had walked on, slowly, deliberately, without looking back. Without acknowledging the crowd, without any theatrical gesture or dramatic exit. He simply walked back into the shadows as if he had just completed a perfectly routine errand, and the 50,000 people in that field erupted into a sound that nobody who was there has ever been able to adequately describe. A sound that was part roar and part gasp, and part the collective exhale of tens of thousands of people who had just witnessed something they instinctively understood they would never see again. The aftermath. Metallica resumed their set after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes. Hetfield said something into the microphone, but accounts vary on whether it was a joke to break the tension or a genuine acknowledgement of what had just happened. What is consistent across every eyewitness account is that Hetfield played the rest of that show differently. The swagger was still there, because swagger was built into James Hetfield's DNA. But there was something else underneath it, something more careful, more aware, as if the encounter with Lemmy had recalibrated something fundamental in how he understood his own place in the history of the music he played. The setlist continued, the pyrotechnics fired on cue, and by the time the encore was finished and the house lights came up over Donington Park, the crowd was exhausted and exhilarated in the way that only a truly transcendent concert experience can produce. But backstage, the real story was just beginning to unfold. The festival staff and crew members who saw Lemmy return to the Motorhead area after his stage invasion describe a man who was completely calm, almost eerily so, as if the confrontation had drained some long-held tension from his body rather than adding to it. He sat down in his usual spot, cracked open a fresh bottle of Jack Daniels, lit a Marlboro, and said nothing about what had just happened. His crew knew better than to ask. Lemmy was not a man who explained himself, and the people who had been around him long enough understood that what they had just witnessed was not a planned stunt or a publicity grab. It was something far more personal, a line that had been crossed, and a boundary that had been reestablished in the most public and most Lemmy way possible. What changed between them? The relationship between Hetfield and Lemmy after that night became something that neither man ever fully explained in public, but the evidence of its transformation was visible to anyone who paid attention over the following 2 decades. Hetfield, who had always spoken respectfully about Motorhead in interviews, began speaking about Lemmy with a reverence that went beyond professional courtesy. In a 1997 interview, Hetfield described Lemmy as one of the few people in rock and roll who had never compromised a single thing about who he was, and while he did not reference the Donington incident directly, the emotional weight in his voice when discussing Lemmy was unmistakable. There were other signs, too. Metallica began inviting Motorhead as a direct support act on several major tours, and Hetfield personally requested Lemmy's band, with crew members from both camps revealing that Hetfield made a point of greeting Lemmy at every show. The two men found an unexpected common ground in the years that followed, a kinship built not on the confrontation itself, but on what the confrontation had revealed. Both men were, at their core, survivors. Hetfield had buried his pain and rage over a childhood scarred by his mother's death from cancer, by the Christian Science beliefs that had prevented her from seeking treatment, and by the alcoholism that nearly destroyed him and his band in the early 2000s. Lemmy had buried his own damage beneath decades of speed, whiskey, and an almost superhuman refusal to show weakness of any kind. In each other, they recognized the particular kind of armor that men of their generation wore, the armor that said you could bleed as long as you never let anyone see you bleed, and that recognition created a bond that went deeper than music. The last years. As Lemmy's health began to deteriorate in the 2010s, the dynamic between the two men shifted again, this time into something that people close to both camps describe as genuinely tender, though neither Lemmy nor Hetfield would have ever used that word. Lemmy had been diagnosed with diabetes and was forced to switch from his beloved Jack Daniels to vodka and orange juice, a change that anyone who knew him understood was deeply unsettling. His performances became visibly more labored, his famous gravelly voice losing some of its power, his body beginning to betray the decades of punishment he had inflicted upon it. The man whose blood was so saturated with toxins that doctors reportedly warned against any attempt to detoxify him, fearing that his body had adapted so completely to the chemicals that removing them could trigger a fatal shock, was finally starting to slow down in ways that even his legendary stubbornness could not disguise. Hetfield was among those who reached out during this period, not with public gestures or performative concern, but with the quiet, consistent presence of someone who understood that Lemmy would reject anything that smelled like pity. Those who witnessed their interactions during this period described conversations that were brief, direct, and devoid of sentimentality, which was exactly how Lemmy preferred all communication. There were no grand speeches about legacy or influence. There were no tearful reconciliations or dramatic bedside confessions. There were just two men who had spent their lives screaming into microphones and beating music out of wood and steel and electricity, sitting together in the knowledge that the clock was running out and that some things did not need to be said out loud to be understood. December 28, 2015. When Lemmy died on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday and only 2 days after receiving a terminal cancer diagnosis, the metal world collapsed into a grief that transcended the usual celebrity mourning cycle. This was not just the death of a musician. It was the death of a philosophy, a way of life, a walking monument to the idea that rock and roll was not something you played. It was something you were, every minute of every day until the very last breath left your body. Hetfield posted a tribute that was widely shared across social media, and while the words were carefully chosen and publicly appropriate, those who knew the history between the two men could read between the lines and find something more, a private grief nested inside the public one, a farewell to someone who had taught him a lesson that no guitar teacher, no producer, and no business manager had ever been able to deliver. The lesson was simple, and it was the same lesson that Lemmy had been teaching the world since 1975 when he walked out of that Canadian jail cell and swore he would build a band louder and meaner than anything the world had ever heard. The lesson was that age is not a weakness, experience is not a liability. And the old man, the one with the leather face and the poisoned blood and the bass guitar slung so low it nearly scraped the ground, the old man was still the most dangerous person on any stage he chose to walk onto, not because he was the loudest or the fastest or the youngest, but because he had been there longer, bled more, survived more, and refused more compromises than anyone else in the building. That was what Lemmy taught James Hetfield on that summer evening in Donington Park, and that was what 50,000 fans witnessed in a silence that still echoes through the history of heavy metal 30 years later. Some lessons do not come from books or interviews or documentaries. Some lessons walk right up to you on a stage in front of the whole world, look you dead in the eye, and dare you to call them old again.